It's 2 hours and available. Yeah, we usually take a little break. Who's your friend?
Yeah, this is Buddy. It's so perfect. Yeah, I know people can think. You know, it's hard to drive this thing upside down.
Is this going to be the chamber?
It can be.
Sometimes it works.
Turned on. It's
So,
probably not turned on.
but there's no way to point other than to put your finger over there because.
Yeah, the laser doesn't work. It works lovely on the drapes, but not on the.
This doesn't change either.
It's not working.
That was
All right, we won't use that today. Can you use that? That's on. The battery's maybe dead. It's going dead.
This class has been a little better than most of the classes. More relaxing time.
So I could possibly, yeah, like that.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
You don't really want to be doing anything.
Figure out what we're gonna do, so that might, So Ryan, you know that Melissa moved to pediatrics. Melissa McGuire, who was the support staff person for the training right in the past. And Ryan and I moved to so we've been primarily inside before in the comparative effectiveness research center. He is now 50-50 with the CTS and his grade. If this general physician is returning to do different things,
Oh,
to do fewer
trying to
things, sort of try to.
Well,
But I would like to talk to you about one of the things you're thinking about. Right.
now, the president hasn't gotten small.
Right.
The last few years, I've seen.
Right. We would like to take advantage of you.
We are.
So,
But you know, I mean, for a newborn man, right now, that's appropriate.
Okay. Okay, so go ahead. Morning. So today we're fortunate to have Dr. Untitled, who is a professor in the Division of General Internal Medicine in the Department of Medicine. Dr. Huddle was educated in Illinois, I think at Champaign-Urbana, and he got, in addition to his medical degree, a PhD in history of medicine. He's had a particular career-long interest in medical professionalism and aspects of ethics that affect both the way in which academic medical centers work and in the way in which research is conducted. So he's going to talk today about research oversight and how some of our bioethical principles got developed in the first place. I think he really generally likes to have this be an interactive session, so be prepared to participate.
Yeah, hopefully we can have a conversation. I am primarily a clinician educator. I do have an interest in, I do research in a conceptual sense. I don't actually participate in clinical studies. But I served 8 years on the IRB and therefore have a fair amount of familiarity with research oversight and some have spent some time thinking about the ethics of it. And so today I'm hoping we can talk about the ethics and to some extent the way those ethics are translated into the real world and whether that works or whether it doesn't work. etc. Now, you all I know are training to be researchers. Are many of you also clinical? How many of you are clinical? Just to give me okay, so about half. All right. Cool. Did any of you get a chance to look at the materials to sort of get your thoughts going about this process? Good. So maybe many of you saw the little AV presentation. Excellent. So in that, I mean, what I tried to do was sort of give you a brief overview of the common rule, what the context was for that developing, a little bit of a description of the IRB regime that came out of that, beginning in 1981. How IRB review actually works, I mean, the human subject protocol, I mean, hopefully you've also seen that at least. Categories of review, what kinds of research, some kinds of research are eligible for expedited review or even exempt. And then how the IRB review actually works, and that's the bolts of it, what actually happens in the meeting. As you saw, 60 protocols reviewed over 3 to 4 hours. You know, attention is provided to studies that are submitted to the IRB, but you might say the attention has to be somewhat perfunctory, just given the limitations of the amount of time that's spent. And then some criticisms of the system. I mean, the research community has very frequently voiced the opinion that this is kind of too much. It's unnecessarily onerous. It's bureaucratic. The bureaucratic aspects of it don't really sort of translate the ethical concerns very well or very effectively, and things could be done differently. On the other hand, there are a lot of people in public discussion who would argue that, in fact, it's not rigorous enough. Maybe IRB review should be more than it is. Things slip through the cracks, and ethical problems happen that ought to be picked up. So that's kind of where we start. So during this session, as I said, my hope is we can have some conversation. I want to talk a little more about the historical context, about arguments pro and con, research oversight back when all this was starting out, and then compare the situation then to some extent with the more recent situation, talk about some research mishaps that have happened in more recent years, and ask the question, is the situation today really comparable to the situation back in 1981? And maybe do things need to change? If we have time, we might even talk about some proposed changes that might actually happen. And you may know that there's been a movement to reform the common rule officially since 1911. And people have wondered, when is this going to happen? But HHS actually published a NPR notice of proposed rulemaking set out some potential reforms to the common rule just this past year. And the public comment period on that just closed a month ago. So something may actually happen in the fairly near future, which is of great interest, to those of you who are going to be operating under what may be a new regime. Well, so if we ask the question, what about research mishaps, back then compared to more recently, what's the context of the common rule development? Probably most of you have some inkling of this already. The 1970s, it's early 1970s. Memories of the Nazi doctors and horrible things that they did in the name of medical research are fairly fresh in everybody's mind. There have been some fairly sensational revelations of what seemed like research abuses in the American medical community. The Willowbrook Hospital hepatitis experiment, hepatitis is injected into kids who don't have hepatitis to investigate hepatitis. The Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital cancer experiment, cancer cells are injected into elderly residents of an institution, unbeknownst to them, to investigate immune responses to cancer cells. And then Henry Beecher, an anesthesiologist at Harvard, who had an interest in medical ethics, sort of combs through the medical literature and basically detects a series of experiments that the medical community has done, which seem questionable, seem problematic, seem possibly wrong. And publishes a New England Journal article which is received very sensationally. And then in 1972, the Tuskegee experiment was revealed. Black men with syphilis, starting back in the 30s, are observed to investigate the character of latent syphilis and are not treated, which you may argue, well, in 1932, it's not very good. But going through the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, I mean, by then, we've had good treatment for quite a while. Penicillin is there in the late 40s, early 50s, and yet these patients are observed without treatment. It seems fairly wrong. So that's sort of what's in the air as the government starts to think about what needs to be done to make sure that the medical community performs research in an ethical way. Doesn't do this kind of thing, this kind of abusive stuff. Just to kind of some, what does Beecher find when he looks back at the recent American medical literature? Well, he finds placebo-controlled trials for strep throat. After it's fairly well accepted that penicillin works for strep throat, he finds effectively placebo-controlled trials for typhoid fever, which probably seems even a little more problematic than strep throat. After it's known that chloramphenicol is very effective in treating typhoid fever. Study the new antibiotic in children. You give them this antibiotic, it's known to have liver toxicity. You want to investigate the toxicity, but kids have no indication for antibiotics in the first place. And then patients undergoing routine bronchoscopy, unbeknownst to them, an evaluation of transbronchial cannulation of the heart. They don't give permission before the procedure for this to happen. They may not even know it's happening. They're having their heart cannulated during their bronchoscopy for something totally unrelated. So I think naturally, the public is upset. Regulatory bodies are upset. The government is upset. So HHS, very naturally, wants to change things and starts developing the common rule. So the argument for research oversight, it seems fairly intuitive, does it not? Does it not seem fairly plausible? This is what the medical community is doing. Is this not abusive? Do we not, therefore, need to look over their shoulder and make sure they do things properly, make sure they do things ethically, make sure they stop doing this kind of thing that they've been doing? Any of you, does that resonate? Okay. Well, it didn't resonate with everybody. So I think it's very interesting because who's as the common rule is developed, it starts to become clear what kind of a regime is going to be involved. And major figures in the academic medical establishment push back. And they push back very hard. And who are they? Well, there's some of the grand old men, the leading lights of the research establishment. Franz Engelfinger, editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Walsh McDermott, eminent infectious disease investigator, member of the progenitor of the Institute of Medicine at that time. These are people at the top of the profession who've engaged in research for a long time. And so they see this coming. They see what's happening. They see the beginnings of the common rule and talk about IRBs and research oversight. And what do they say? I mean, I think particularly in the Engelfield article, I mean, you got the sense that sort of injured, not really, maybe not complete innocence, but injured, you guys are blowing this out of proportion. This isn't as bad as you say. Most medical researchers are good people who want to do the right thing, and we're not this evil bunch of Nazis that maybe public hype made us out to be. And these ethics rules are being developed. They're going to go overboard. I mean, if there's kind of an atmosphere that's wrong here in regard to suspicion of the medical community. And ethics bureaucracy. I mean, that's what you're talking about creating. You're talking about creating a bureaucracy. Well, that can impede research, and it will impede research.
I'm curious, since you have a PhD in medical history, the discoveries that came out of the 40s, 50s, 60s, I guess 70s, how does that compare to now, discoveries now that we have this bureaucracy oversight? I mean,
in other words, has discovery gotten any less?
Yeah.
Because of the bureaucracy?
Yeah, what are we getting now that we have this?
I think that really raises that's an interesting question. What makes it difficult is that it's a counterfactual question. What would have happened if we hadn't done this way back then?
It's not what would have happened. I'm just asking what did and what's happening now.
What would have happened compared to what did happen? What would have happened in 2000? What would have happened by 2016 compared to what did happen? A lot's happened, and you might be inclined to make the argument. Well, the ethics bureaucracy didn't really impede much, did it? Because look at the way science has gone forward. Things are okay. Now, if I were what would Franz Egelfinger say to that? He might say, well, sure, some good things have happened, but think about what would have happened if we hadn't had this bureaucratic impedance to medical progress. We might have been, streets ahead of even where we are today. I mean, sure, it looks good, but we don't have proper comparison, which is what would have happened in the absence. I mean, I think it's a difficult question, and I think you could ask a similar question about the efficacy of the ethics part of it. Because, I mean, clearly there have been some ethical mishaps in recent years. And you could ask the question, well, what impact has the IRB regime had on the ethics of medical research? We had mishaps before. We're having mishaps now. Is this whole process doing any good? And I think the difficulty in answering that question is exactly the same difficulty as in answering your question. Because the advocate could say, well, the resistor could say, so we're still having all these mishaps, so have things really changed? Maybe not. But the advocate could say, well, yeah, we had a few mishaps, but think of how horrible it would have been if we hadn't had anybody doing IRB oversight. I mean, it's just, we like to answer questions, based on what really happened. And this kind of question is not a question that, unfortunately, that kind of information can inform the answer. It's we're necessarily being somewhat speculative.
So I'm pretty familiar that in Europe, for example, there's similar processes to what we have here. I don't know exactly how similar they are, but are there other major environments where there is a lot of biomedical research where the equivalent of an IRB is very different? Like what's it like in Asia and other countries?
Well, you're asking me, unfortunately, you're going beyond my expertise.
It would be interesting to know.
It would be interesting. I mean, I would suspect that, perhaps in, more authoritarian places, there might be less. But I can't really speak without any knowledge. So the argument is, well, if you have a bureaucracy, well, yeah, they can cause problems, but are they really going to do good? What does it take for research to be ethical? Engelfinger and McDermott would say it takes ethical researchers. And if the researchers are not good people, if they're going to be prone to do bad things, no bureaucracy on earth. I mean, nobody's standing in the lab, looking over your shoulder while you're doing stuff. A bureaucratic process, simply by virtue of the nature of what it can do, is the wrong tool for this. I mean, it's the hammer and the hammer and the screw. It's not the hammer and the nail. Plus, you extend ethical rules to the trivial, such as, what a different world. I mean, think about how different the world is. Consent for research use of biospecimens, that's trivial. If you extend ethical concerns to the trivial, things that are really important, that people are going to be distracted from. You multiply ethical concerns. I mean, I say it's a different world because, of course, the ethical use or the research use of biospecimens and how to do that ethically is possibly the hot topic of the day. But the English figure would say, I mean, it's a piece of tissue. Come on. I mean, let's talk about harm and benefit. I mean, let's talk about real people. How can you compare the concerns about a piece of tissue with harms to human subjects? I mean, they, to some extent, perhaps, yes. I mean, clearly, our universe of ethical concern has greatly expanded. So only those with expertise can really be good judges of the ethics of what's being done. You got a committee of people, even if they have some medical expertise on the committee. I mean, they're not going to be experts in the area of the research itself. The ethics of the research will follow from the virtue of the researcher. And then finally, a kind of an argument that might strike you as problematic. Sometimes researchers, they're in this powerful position, and clearly the interests of the subjects of their research are a factor in what they do. But that's not the only consideration for them. They're thinking about the future of humanity. They're thinking about progress of human science and knowledge. They're thinking about the societal impact of maybe great discoveries. And therefore, they need to put God every now and then. Maybe they just need to do that. Only the researcher can adjudicate the societal good versus individual rights or autonomy or individual importance. And that shouldn't be delegated to some committee of people who are ignorant. So I mean, this is the kind of, I mean, the case in favor of it seems obvious. This is the kind of case that smart people who were involved in the research community made against the other regime. Instead of having a bureaucracy, let's develop a culture of ethics in the research community. Let's expose neophyte researchers to ethicists or to good models. Let's make sure the culture in labs or in centers where people are doing research is ethically pristine. And let's make sure that people are under the right influences as they grow up and begin to develop their own careers, so that they will be really good people. Let's focus on that. Let's take the focus away from bureaucracy. So
was there any effect of politics on this from the legislators? Why?
I think there was a lot of political pressure to do something.
And what stand? Like?
I'm sorry?
Like, what are the stands of the major parties in Congress? Or what?
I don't believe that this was really a partisan issue.
Okay. I mean, historically.
I suspect that the members of both parties were probably on the side of those who felt that something needed to be done. So what do you think of this sort of skeptical argument? Does it have any valid points?
I mean, it would be great if we could make everybody act ethically, but, you know, that's easier said than done. That's something that starts in the home when you're growing up. You know, your parents teach you right from wrong. Once you get to the point in your life where you're conducting research.
They teach you right from wrong or not.
Right.
So the horse is out of the barn.
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
I think to the point on the previous slide about, you know, the experts needing to be involved in the process. I think that's one feature that's frustrating for me because I'm, you know, designing this huge protocol and I send it to someone that's never heard of any of this stuff. And there's not really a dialogue between me and this IRB. It's all of this huge separation through emails that endlessly get fired at each other. And I wish there was a way to like just pitch it in a room for 5 or 10 minutes and have a dialogue and then have separation. I agree that there's going to be separation and that a lot of oversight that exists, but I just don't think that the current system is structured in a way that I can help them.
Right, I completely agree with that, and it seems like it wastes a lot of time going back and forth with the emails. It's like, if I could just talk to you and just explain this to you.
Receiving dramatic answers. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because sometimes the IRB actually will, you know, do what you're describing. I mean, if they sort of reach an impasse and they don't get it, you know, they'll invite the investigator to come and, you know, share the rationale or whatever the point of contention is for a few minutes. And maybe that should happen faster than sometimes, you know, maybe the blizzard of emails goes on for too long.
I just think there's a better way to streamline this because, I mean, I had this back to this biospecimens. I had a study on biospecimens that has been drugged through the IRB for months now. It's just like, it's kind of comical at this point, the things that they're pointing at as issues.
Biospecimens is a really interesting topic. I mean, if you look at the NPRM, I mean, one of the probably the biggest change in common rule is going to be how biospecimen search is regulated. And, you know, we may get to that.
But Tom, you may not be aware, everybody in the class actually is going to get to be in an IRB meeting for one session between now and the end of the semester. So it's actually a very, I think I find it an interesting experience. I'm excited. There are things, and I've been called to testify about a research protocol I was doing at the IRB, and, you know, I would have wished it had happened 3 cycles before it actually did. But it was very helpful, and they do that. I think they just get overwhelmed too by the numbers that they're trying to work with.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I guess I feel sort of a little bit sympathetic to the IRB just going through that. But I think it's probably, I mean, I think it is, it's very, what happens is very dependent on, you know, maybe one person really doing the job in terms of really reviewing the protocol properly. So if the protocol is properly presented to the IRB, it only takes that one person, primary reviewer, you know, maybe skipping a little bit for possibly things to get completely messed up. So the IRB certainly has its weak points, absolutely. I mean, any more thought about whether any, you know, this kind of argument is made against the retail oversight regime? I mean, does it have any validity? Are there any parts of it that have any validity?
Has anyone looked at the role of the individual? I mean, it seems like you got the IRB telling the individual what's best for them, you got the doctor telling the individual what's best for them. On this individual side,
The individual meaning
the participant.
The human side participant.
Let them do it. You can do this. I mean, obviously you have some cases where they didn't know what was going on.
So your suggestion is that the consent is really focused upon properly, people really understand what they're getting into. That's the most important point.
Yeah, that could bypass an issue with IRB. I mean, it seems like that's, you know, the main party's concern is the individual, and the individual at the end of the day has to make a decision about what's best for them.
Okay.
Paternalistic to
Seems
shuffle it off to
paternalistic.
some bureaucracy or some other doctor.
But in a couple of research, just not case reports, but I've submitted data for a couple of case series, where we didn't have to inform the patient. It was pre-existing, de-identified information that was gathered for their medical care. And, it would have been, and I don't want to sound lazy, but it would have been a lot more work for me to have to contact that, because I'm in pediatrics, contact that parent, go through the process of explaining to them, here's what I want to do with your child's data. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to come in. It doesn't mean anything extra for you. And then, what if they said no, and then I wouldn't have been able to submit it at all?
Yeah, that's a separate issue. I mean, I'm talking about like this intervention, pulling blood, putting something in biospecimen medical records, and that's.
So the issue of de-identification and whether that sort of mitigates the need for lots of consent and subject involvement, very important issue. The other issue, though, is to what degree the focus of ethical oversight should be on subjects beefing up human subject knowledge, comprehension, understanding, autonomy, yada, 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 on the one hand, or should the major focus of research oversight with regard to ethics be protection of the human subject? Do we need to have an element of journalism? Do we need to sort of be in loco parentis to some extent to human subjects?
I feel like that's what IRB's thing.
Well, I guess my suggestion is there might be a little tension there. I mean, which of those goals is what, are they equally important? Is one more important than the other? If you focus on the person making the decision and that's the thing, then maybe the protection part recedes a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And if you focus on the protection part, then the consent autonomy part recedes a little bit. Do you do both to the max? Do you do one a little bit more than the other? I mean, given what the research enterprise is, how do those two things fit together? I think, I don't think that's really resolved. Yeah.
It seems like looking at like the arguments that they had, and then talking about, it seems like a lot of the historical precedent for coming up with this oversight was from the human subjects protection slant, like in the stuff that Beecher published was a lot of human subjects protection. And it seems to me that
Very much
despite the merits of some of these arguments, it almost seems to me that oversight seems to be kind of a historical inevitability. Because even if we hadn't developed a lot of these common rules, assuming all things being equal in the course of history, the capacity of society to engage in scrutiny and outrage has only increased over the years. And anything that happened, we've still had stuff that's happened that makes us question kind of whether we're doing stuff. That stuff only is amplified now in the current social media X, Y, and Z apparatus that we have. So it seems like oversight probably is kind of a historical inevitability would have happened at some point.
So this didn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
Think about what was happening in the 60s and 70s. Patients' rights movement, revolt and rebellion against many institutions which up until the 50s and 60s, the authority of which was fairly unquestioned in public discussion. Medicine in particular, on a pedestal. And all of that very much thrown into question in the 60s and 70s. And this was one part of that. This is clearly one part of that. And the other point is that I think you're right. I think the early context was very much protection. Protection rather than autonomy was at the forefront in the early days. Now, as the 70s went on and bioethical discussion progressed, autonomy rose in importance. And probably today, people talk more about autonomy than they do about paternalism. But I think there's still this sort of yin and yang. I mean, each has its importance, and we're still, we're trying to figure out how they balance or fail to balance. But protection clearly was early on where the action was. So one thing I wanted to sort of think about was, so 70s, the kinds of abuses that people were responding to. Then there's this regime that came out of that. Well, what about the question of the 1970s versus the 2010s? The people that, we're talking about reforming the common rule, I mean, this is what they're thinking about. Has the situation changed? Are we really prone to do the kinds of things that were being done back then? Are the problems different now? Is there a case to be made that maybe the oversight process ought to be different? I mean, I think most of us, in spite of these skeptical arguments, would say, well, there is a role for oversight. Not all medical researchers, unfortunately, are going to be good people. Somebody does need to be somehow looking over the shoulder of the research community, but can it be done in a way that is perhaps more effective or more attuned to the kinds of problems that are going on at the moment compared to back in 1970 and before? No, I mean, nobody's going to sort of do the Nazi doctor thing now, right? Maybe we're not good completely, but we're better. Are we better than that, perhaps? Have we made some progress? And can we make a case for altering the oversight process in a constructive way that might, in some way, acknowledge differences? And, one way to get at that would be to think about, well, what kinds of problems have been happening more recently? So this is just a laundry list of some recent studies that have been felt to be ethically problematic by known people, some of which you may be familiar with. The ECMO trial for infants with persistent pulmonary hypertension back in the 1980s. American pediatricians began using ECMO for these patients, and they did really well. And the American pediatric community decided that, well, ECMO is pretty good. It's going to become standard of care for this problem. But there wasn't a trial. There were a few little tiny trials, but there wasn't really a big randomized trial of the kind that, in this day and age, we normally require if we're going to say we know for sure that it actually works. So in Britain, a bunch of people said, well, yeah, it looks good, but we need a trial. And so they did a big trial. And a bunch of babies that didn't get ECMO didn't do well. And the Americans looked across the Atlantic and said, you guys are crazy, why'd you do this? We knew that ECMO works. That was not an ethical thing to do. Biopsy study, does anyone know about the biopsy study? Study of the treatment for cutaneous T-cell lymphoma back in the 1990s, claimed the career of an eminent neurodegree dermatologist. Basically, some of his underlings falsified data, had financial interests in the company. Bad scene. The Gelsinger case, you heard a little bit about it if you looked at the AD presentation. Young did in the phase 1 trial, dies tragically. Irregularities in the way the trial was conducted come to light afterwards. Hexamethonium study at Johns Hopkins. Basic physiology. Give hexamethonium to investigate the function of ganglionic nerves in the lung. Did a really good research review using PubMed, and hexamethonium, looked good in the literature that was in there. But then they did the study, and a woman who inhaled hexamethonium actually died. And lo and behold, they went back before in 1964, whenever PubMed starts. There had been a lot of use of hexamethonium in the 50s for hypertension, and some of those people had developed serious pulmonary pathology. And that information had never made it into the literature review of the people who designed the physiological study. So the TGN 1412, that was a trial of a monoclonal antibody. I don't remember what the disease was. I think it was CLL. That was a phase 1 trial, and they had had some animal data, and they used a dose that was like 50 times diluted from a dose that was toxic in animals. And a bunch of the first group of human subjects who got the monoclonal antibody went into multi-organ failure and died. And there was a lot of debate about the animal data, and should they have had more animal data, yada, yada, yada. The support trial, y'all know about that? So that's the recent UAV. Problematic.
UAV on the list twice.
Hey, here we are. Here we are. Come on. Familiarity, right? So, use of oxygen for value previous for infants. Questions about this, you know, an arm that gets high oxygen and an arm that doesn't get high oxygen, as opposed to standard of care, which had been individual clinicians making individual judgments about how much oxygen to give, trying to minimize it, you know, as much as could be done in an individual case. And instead of, you know, having these two arms which were either, you know, all one or all the other, and, you know, lots of babies that went to oxygen got blindness. And so A, was the study designed properly, and B, I mean, the consent form, you know, didn't really emphasize the risk of blindness, you know, perhaps to the degree that it should have. This industry trial of second generation antipsychotics in the early 2000s, the human subjects don't have a lot of control of whether they're in the trial and how they can get out of the trial. And such a human subject, his mother goes to a psychiatrist and said, you know, my kid is not doing well, he needs to stop this and do something else. And the psychiatrist says no, and the kid commits suicide. And then the Duke genomic chemotherapy sensitivity predictors, falsification of data. So, you know, you saw a laundry list of 1960s and before, and this is a laundry list of, you know, 2000s and 1990s. Anything we can conclude from thinking about the two contexts? You know, we have this apparatus, we have this tool, this ethics bureaucracy, this IRB regime. You know, think about its application to this. Did it fail?
I think it's an imperfect entity. I think it's doing its best. You know, I don't think it's going to fix everything. Stuff's going to happen because you have this entity that's governed or, you know, screening these protocols and things, but then it's ultimately in the hands of the researchers. You know?
I mean, could one not, you know, if let's say one is Franz Engelfinger, you know, he's long dead, but I mean, let's say he was looking back on the last 30, 40 years and looking at the situation compared to his predictions in his article, you know, what might he have said?
I think one difference to me that's notable is that in the 60s and before then, it seems like minority groups were targeted for research with Nazis and in Alabama at Tuskegee. And now you see notable absence of minorities from research. That seems to be a positive and a negative, I would say.
Okay, absolutely. I mean, big push to make sure that minorities are represented in human subjects of research, just so that they can get the benefits of research. And you know, maybe that's a current problem.
Well, I think what's interesting to me is that the IRB is created for all the protection of human subjects, but it almost backfires in that there's so much illegal ramifications, and that our society has also changed over the years, and that we are more reactionary to things. And so it's like she was talking about, there's a push for more minorities to be included, but at the same time, you know, the trial
the paperwork that we read about, there were African Americans who were less likely to be included in the trials because of lower education, lower socioeconomic status, and that sort of thing. So it's almost like we create all of these mechanisms to protect the human subjects, but at the same time, we end up not including them even though we're trying to.
Because they end up suffering.
Right.
So does the bureaucracy actually discourage some of what we ought to be doing?
Right.
So it has some negative side effects.
And unintended consequences.
I think you see some different problems too in the more recent studies of more data falsification and conflict of interest problems, financial conflict of interest problems. I think a lot of pressure from academic institutions to be promoted, or from to get grants, or to get pharma to make money, and I think you see a lot more of those pressures influencing research more recently.
So research now compared to 1970 era is much bigger business than it used to be. And on the one hand, government funding has skyrocketed, but industry funding has also skyrocketed. And that leads to other, incentive problems, which perhaps were less prominent back in the early days. And you can, the IRBs actually don't really address conflict of interest. I mean, addressing conflict of interest is turned into a separate bureaucracy. I mean, there's now, the Conflict of Interest Review Board, which is completely a different entity from the IRB. And so those ethical concerns have actually somewhat diverged in terms of how we address them. But that entire apparatus, I mean, you could argue much of it grew out of what happened in the Yeltsin case. So that's a fairly, our urge to address that is a fairly recent development.
Seems like the old stuff is a lot more extreme too. The way you were saying, you're injecting viruses, cancer, all in treatment. I mean, this
seems qualitatively maybe less egregious. So, so I think, you could reconstruct what Engelfinger might say. Well, surely, my predictions have come true. I mean, I said that it was, the individual researcher was the important part, and that the IRB bureaucracy wasn't going to get at that. And surely that's what's demonstrated in many, if not most, of these research mishaps, which the IRB did not pick up, as I predicted, would not happen because it's impossible. Is it not the case that perhaps the IRB is spinning its wheels, and research ethics is what it is, based upon whether researchers are good people or not, mostly. I mean, Engelfinger might say that. I mean, how much would anyone be inclined to push back? So maybe he would make the case as, the problems now, the IRB is really not well designed to get at most of them. Maybe, we need research oversight that's less onerous at the approval stage, but maybe more attuned to doing some real-time monitoring of research when it's actually happening. There are lots of ways one could spin a case for reform of the oversight process from the kind of perspective that somebody like Engelfinger might have.
I disagree a little bit about the idea of just like bad apples or people, whether a researcher is a good person or not. I think a lot of these situations, people are probably good people or have good intentions, and they get put into situations where there's a lot of external pressures, and maybe some of that judgment process breaks down. You put people.
So it's a cultural problem?
I think it's a cultural, systemic problem of just, I think,
Too much competition
I think the
to get good
competition,
results?
the pressure to get good results, the pressure to be promoted, the pressure to get grant money, I think that culture that we've created puts good people in situations where they're tempted to, well, maybe fudge this data point a little bit, or it's not so bad, I'm just gonna, tweak that, or get rid of that outlier, or, things that don't seem too bad, but
So you might say maybe we need to focus on the culture of
I think
research
so.
institutions, or culture of individual labs or centers, or things like that. Which is a point I think Engelfinger might have made. I mean, he might have said something like that. Well, I think, we'll take a break here in a moment, but I think there is an argument against this kind of argument. And I think the argument might go, sure, some of the mishaps of the pre-1960 era seem egregious, but others of them seem exactly analogous to the kinds of things that have happened recently. I mean, think about the ECMO trial, What's the question? The question is, when do you need a trial before you decide that you really know something? And wasn't that exactly the same question that was asked in the placebo versus penicillin for strep throat, or chloramphenicol versus placebo for typhoid? Sure, it seems like it works, but does it really work? Do we need a trial? And is not that the kind of question that an IRB might usefully wrestle with? Indeed, maybe IRBs could do some trial monitoring. Consent issues such as those raised in the conduct of the support trial. I mean, surely an IRB is well suited to, consider whether the consent, what was in the consent form for that trial was good or not. Surely that's exactly the kind of question that an IRB maybe should have been able to do something constructive about. Yes, there are bad apples, and yes, we don't catch all the bad apples, but there are systemic issues, systemic questions about research design and consent design, which these trials, many of them, bring up, which in fact the IRB is very well suited to address. And the point to make is that, sure, the glass is half empty, but the glass is also half full. Maybe there were some IRB failures in these situations. IRBs can't prevent all mishaps, but maybe they can do a better job than they do. Maybe we need to think about how we IRB folks can do better rather than conclude that the IRB bureaucracy can be jettisoned because there's still mishaps happening.
And then I think there's the other side of the coin when you have a researcher that wants to conduct some research that really would benefit people and really could have, some great discovery, and there's so much red tape and so many restrictions placed on them by the IRB that they aren't able to conduct the research, and how many people, end up being hurt by that because they're not able to conduct the research that they wanted to do.
So can we reduce some of the bureaucratic burden and retain the ethical scrutiny? I think a lot of people who have been focusing on IRB reform are trying to sort of think of ways to do exactly that. Let's go ahead and break, and maybe when we come back we can talk about a little bit about the specific Gelsinger case, which is just in case, and then maybe a little bit about the NPRM, I mean the new things on the horizon for the common rule.
Dr. Cron.
Familiar with whether there are any data participant in the clinical study is really aware that there are IRBs and whether that encourages them to participate.
I can kind of hear them now.
I would suspect they're not aware. Yes.
Yeah.
So interesting. So this is part of the common rule kind of thing too, I guess, but the CTSAs are trying to encourage ways to have centralized IRBs that
Yeah.
that allow
Or have one RV
one
for
RV
multi-sex
to
studies.
deal with multi-sex studies. And it's
And that has.
really
that
has
those-
highlighted the extent to which institutions view their IRBs as part of their own risk management rather than as articulating a protection for the study subjects.
Right,
Because that's, they're not.
Protection for legal ramifications from the
Right.
institution itself.
Right.
Hey.
Okay, great. Sorry. So I'm going to show you about 14. Is that okay? Right. That'd be great.
So I didn't get to that.
To the condo?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She mentioned she let it go.
Yeah. And it seemed like she was, there were some things they wanted to do in the medical school.
Yes,
So but it
She's
was,
focused on
and the fact was going to just over. So, interesting to see how the portfolio she wants to do develops. The person's was.
I mean, her background was undoubted.
Yeah. She seemed sensible.
Yeah, well, logical.
Nice person, so.
Okay, and I told her I would, maybe next week I would do that.
Yeah.
I know it's not gonna be good.
Yeah, like,
Yeah. Up and down so much.
So you all, if you look at the materials, you sort of went through this, and had a basic idea of what happened during the Gilsinger trial. But I feel a little bit close to it. I was at Penn and Humanities for a couple of years, of course, well before this happened. But certainly know some of the Penn faculty who sort of talked about it at the time. I mean, it really made a sensation. It was very widely discussed and very difficult for the investigators in the aftermath of what happened. And I guess what I'll do is I'll go fairly quickly through the account of what happened, and we can talk about the sort of questions that are raised by the study. So this is during the early period of recombinant vector therapy. Most of the trials that have been conducted are phase 1, ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency, genetic defect, people with severe forms of it die as infants. But those who are mosaics, as Jesse Gelsinger was, can live a normal life if they very carefully attend to their diet. So escalating doses of an adenovirus vector engineered to express the OTC gene. 3 to 4 subjects, 1 of 6 dose regimens, each group getting a higher dose than the last. And it's an ounce of fluid to the hepatic vein through a femoral catheter. The study had been approved. The recombinant DNA advisory committee was in a subcommittee of the NIH, which in the early days of DNA therapy, and it was very controversial, very publicly sensitive. So those who were doing it wanted a lot of discussion. So this committee actually looked at studies like this separately from scientific bodies who approved the study for scientific merit in the NIH. So there was a lot of discussion of research design of studies of this sort during this period, and there was a bit of back and forth as to how it was going to be done, and not everything was communicated to all of the bodies involved. Do you put the vector right into the liver? Do you seek to avoid hepatotoxicity by putting it into the bloodstream? It's going to get to the liver anyway, so if somebody decides, well, let's just put it there, maybe you can avoid toxicity elsewhere. Not everybody hears about that. Informed consent document. There may be life-threatening liver inflammation, possibly requiring transplant. Maybe less language about risk of death. Conflict of interest disclosure, a very new thing at this time. Most studies didn't really talk about conflict of interest, but it's mentioned in the consent document, not, without really any detail as to what it amounted to. Trial begins, 15 people go through escalating doses without really much problem, as does the first subject of Jesse's cohort, and he, who is basically a healthy adolescent, doing pretty well, gets the vector, quickly develops multi-system illness and organ failure, and dies a week later, 5 days later, 4 days later. What happened to him? Not completely clear. Yes, he had an unusually severe inflammatory reaction. Why did he have that reaction and no one else did? Speculation, immune memory, genetic predisposition, previous exposure may or may not have been important. As of 2009, it's still unclear exactly why, what happened to Jesse Belson, what happened to him. So it's all gone over very carefully after the fact. Criticisms that emerge. Jesse did not meet eligibility criteria. He occasionally had ammonia levels over 70. The argument would have been, well, his ammonia level fluctuated a lot. Most of the time it was below 70. And every now and then maybe it got a little bit over 70. This is not a clinically important difference. He is who he is. He's healthy. He's doing fine. His ammonia, if he follows his diet, his ammonia level is okay. But his ammonia level is occasionally over 70. And the protocol said you're not eligible if that's the case. There was some animal data that hadn't gotten into the grant submission. Protocol specified levels of liver toxicity have been reached in previous subjects, and yet the study had not been held. There were changes in the protocol that had not been communicated. It had been agreed to widen exclusion criteria such that fewer subjects would have been eligible, but those changes were not made. Unclear to me whether that would have affected Jesse's eligibility. Then, two big elephants in the room. One, the design of the study. The study could have been done in babies. The study could have been done in infants with the full severity of the transcarbamylase deficiency, who were doomed to die and therefore had much less to lose than a healthy 17-year-old kid. And why, so why do the study in the Jesse population as opposed to the infant population? And then the whole thing about the conflict of interest, what about that? So you look at all this, and what do you say? Are there ethical problems here? And if so, what are they?
Other question, do we know if the withholding of the animal deaths and the animal data was purposeful?
I think the presumption is that it was not.
think anybody with medical training will know the potential danger of injecting a foreign antigen in your bloodstream. So I'm very much against of the potential gain for a 17-year-old of partial deficiency to get this treatment. Yeah. It
So
should
they-
be
so they-
treated on those infants have very thin perspective if they're not treated. Yeah, only.
So the design of the study is a real issue.
Yeah, so the potential gain for them is big, and then and afterwards, I can only say beforehand.
But I think means gene therapy has proven like many good results also, and this is maybe an exception. And I think with chemotherapy also or any other treatment, people die. I mean, so you cannot like take an exception because recently gene therapy has been used to cure blindness in patients, and it was in Time magazine. So you
you
cannot
might-
just throw it out. Like,
So you might say, look, this is a phase 1 study. Research is dangerous. Bad things happen. This is a case where a bad thing happened. It's not necessarily preventable. Ethical issues here are really of secondary importance. I mean, this is mainly a tragic result of science properly based, more or less properly conducted. I mean, the few irregularities in regard to the protocol are just that. They're minor irregularities. And this would have happened, whether that protocol had been exactly followed or not.
and another thing is like, I personally care for it because I have worked in gene therapy research. So another thing I see is this is highlighted in comparison to other cases. One reason I feel because pharmaceuticals want the patient to pop a pill every day, as opposed to gene therapy, which kind of promise like a long-term cure. So
So maybe the criticism of this study is unfair, and maybe some of that
means too much criticism goes on this, as opposed to other.
Yeah, what about those daggone drug companies?
Yeah, I mean,
And it sounded like it was FDA approved?
Right.
I mean, the kid could have just got it as part of routine care, some physician elected to.
Well, it was approved. It was approved in the trial.
Okay.
I mean, it wasn't approved.
But still, treatments like that can be used outside of a clinical trial, and it seems like it's,
Well, only once they're
yeah,
once they're approved for something. This had not been approved for anything.
I know that, but other treatments. And so if something like this were to happen as part of routine care, was there truly any neglect or they purposefully?
So you're suggesting, well, maybe this is a bad outcome of an agent for which there was therapeutic plausibility, there was scientific plausibility, and you're thinking that this was potentially going to be a benefit. And isn't that similar to what physicians do when they use drugs off-label?
Right.
They take a drug which hasn't really been studied in a given population, and they give it to the patient because there's some reason, maybe their buddy used it and they had a good result. And
But it seems
isn't
like
this analogous to that? What's the failure of the analogy?
he was well, I don't know if he needed any treatment at all.
Okay, so the research design issue.
It's just unethical to expose him to this disease. Right. So he is a volunteer, but he does not know the danger, nor does the one who administers it. This is kind of very dangerous situation. Nobody knows.
I want to talk about the research design issue, but let me bracket that for the moment. And let's just go through some of the other issues, if there are other issues, and then we'll get to the research design issue. I do think that's a very important issue. I think the problem with the analogy that you draw is that in the off-label case, all those drugs, the FDA has approved them after studies demonstrating safety and then efficacy for some condition. And so yes, efficacy for some other condition hasn't been shown, but safety studies have been done. The drug has been shown to be safe. And so that's a very different situation from a phase 1 study. something that's.
But would a single death, this unexpected event make the treatment be considered unsafe?
Well, there's one bad outcome in a phase 1 study, and you're saying, what does that mean? And you're right. Maybe adjustments can be made. Maybe you use the vector to lower concentration or something. Sure. I mean, the science has to go on. And so you're implying once again that this is an unfortunate result, but it's not necessarily out of the range of what we might expect in the conduct of good science.
Even just think, even in recent weeks in England, this new gene editing technique CRISPR has been approved for use in infants, right? Like infant means in embryo, like this gene editing technique for CRISPR. So a lot of ethical things are going on, but unless we try, we don't know what.
But I think the difference here is if it had been designed in a different way, perhaps the death wouldn't have seemed so egregious. To me, it seems like he had very little potential benefit from this trial, whereas in an infant who is faced with mortality, you could see the benefit from trying this medication. And secondarily, who is this going to be used for in the long run? It seems like it wouldn't be used for anyone in Jesse's case. So I don't really see how enrolling him in the trial will help push the science forward if it will be used in an infant in the long run. I don't know.
So maybe the infant has some potential to benefit, but I mean, I think even the stronger point would be the infant has less to lose.
Yes.
But does that make it just as ethical to give this possible harmful treatment to an infant just because they're going to die, as opposed to
Good question.
I think the risk
a little bit more healthy version?
Yeah, I think that
You try anything.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
If it's not a valid ethical reason for doing something, just because somebody's going to die, you can do whatever you want to do.
There's potential
You're trying to
benefit.
help them.
So the gestalt I'm getting from you all is that, this stuff is probably of less importance. I mean, yeah, they should have done it right. I mean, you say you're going to do something, you do it right. But this stuff is of somewhat less importance. This is possibly a critical issue. What about this issue? What about the financial issue?
The investigator had like a 30% ownership in the company that was going to make this drug. I mean, I think that's pretty significant.
But is it because he believes in it that it'll help patients? Maybe.
Yeah, but you could argue maybe someone else should have conducted a trial. Like if someone just that had less, that was more partial, could have oversaw the protocol.
And it incentivizes them to give the treatment to someone that wouldn't necessarily benefit. It expands the scope of who he's doing the drug to.
So this is a case where all of the dials in the minds of the investigators are pointing in the same direction. I mean, it's not just their intellectual commitment or their intellectual perspective, but their financial interests, their future well-being, everything sort of says this has to work. And that shouldn't be, is what you're saying.
Oh, I see that. Also, scientifically, why don't they do some tests like a skin test? Because before people have penicillin, which is a foreign antigen, they had skin tests. I think the investigator did not fully imagine the possible harm to the person who gets a foreign antigen. I think that I would put that criticism on.
So maybe there could be some sort of
Yeah, there are routines like this.
some sort of way to expose the subject to
a large amount, and then they need to do a skin test. Even people who get a routine penicillin do that.
And so I'm not,
Why do they just
I'm not enough of a scientist in this area to be able to comment on that.
Yeah, they
Maybe so. I mean, I don't know. I don't
concerned
know.
enough to consult people with expertise, and they do. They just need to do more homework.
Maybe they did though, I don't know what information was available at the time about immune response to antigens, I don't know. But hopefully they did their homework, but if not, maybe this is a case of now we know potential risks that weren't known at the time and they will be predicted.
One of my
And
questions is,
anaphylactic reaction to penicillin. So people know and then they do something to, before they put a dose on a person.
one of my questions is just thinking about the conflict of interest is, why OTC deficiency? Does that have any bearing as to why they picked this particular disorder to study? Did it have any relations to what the company was working on at the time? Because, it's almost equivalent to saying, well, why don't we do gene therapy for something like phenylketonuria, which is a disorder, it's a metabolic disorder, but ultimately is controlled by diet. Like, was there some other investment in this particular condition that kind of started the chain down the road to say, okay, we're going to be doing research on this particular set of subjects, and even in PKU, the full mutation, like those kids will live, and so I don't know, it seems interesting to me as to kind of how the chip fell, so to speak, in the development of the program.
I honestly don't know the answer to that. Clearly, the company had a big, it had this worked out. I mean, there was potential for great financial gain and success, even though, the OTC population of patients is of limited size. But still, they saw that this could make a lot of money.
Yeah, but the one patients that have the full mutation, though, I mean, they can't control that with diet, right? That's what we're talking about, like the infants.
Well, yeah, they're dead. I mean, they're
yeah.
Right. Doomed.
So that is different.
Right, but it wasn't, but the study wasn't conducted with that difference in mind.
Right.
It would enroll all these people who necessarily wouldn't have perished from the full mutation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me, so let me just, if I were James Wilson, how might I push back against your point? What if I said, well, yeah, I had a big stake in the company, but that in no way affected my design of the protocol or the way that the study was designed by my underlings who did most of the design work, and sure we had a financial interest, and that was a good thing because people who have a financial interest in something and which connects to their intellectual commitments, that's simply going to make them more committed to doing good work and to doing good science that actually leads in a productive direction. And the fact that there are incentives for scientists to succeed, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. I mean, why is the scientific community in the United States more productive in terms of innovation than scientific communities elsewhere? I mean, part of it is because if science succeeds, I mean, people will do very well. And what's wrong with that? Isn't that a good thing? Don't we want scientific progress as best we can get it? And isn't financial incentives to success part of what leads to such success? And in my case, that incentive had, in terms of what went wrong, that incentive had no impact whatsoever. It did not lead to what went wrong. And in fact, James Wilson said something very similar to that when he later wrote his reminiscence article in 2009. He basically said, the COI issue, I mean, it didn't affect what happened.
I can almost see it from a parent's perspective or from a potential study participant's perspective, like, oh, well, you have money at stake here and you really want this to be successful, and so,
you're going to be extra careful.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just looking at it from that point of view, that would almost, if I didn't know what I know being on this end of it, that would almost make me feel more safe about being in their study.
Even being like an investigator on the study, that's probably maybe makes you a little more vulnerable to if things came up in these animal studies. Oh, well, let's not report that because we want the study to continue. We don't want to have to wait and go through the IRB again.
What about these patients that hit the liver toxicity and nothing was done, nothing was reevaluated at that time? It was just kind of brushed on. And
Yeah.
So that had been, the potential issue, rearing its head. possibly.
May not be a valid analogy, but the Challenger disaster and the aftermath of that sort of parallel to this in the sense that the commission's findings were that this was a systemic failure to report. In that case, there were engineers that were ringing a bell saying, don't do this, but the right set of circumstances, after many successful launches, happened, coalesced at the right point for this to happen. And, you know, unless we're going to be willing to stick one or several IRB people in our labs to oversee every step of the process, I don't know how things like this can't inevitably happen.
And
Just because of the uncertain, you know, the pervasive uncertainty in research altogether.
so sometimes researchers sort of, you know, they get on this sort of track and it kind of consumes them and they stop seeing warning signs, or they stop, you know, maybe they're a little less sensitive to reality. And, you know, if you want to make that argument regarding conflict of interest, you could say, well, sure, you know, the financial incentive, you know, may have that effect on people. It may make them a little less sensitive to making sure things are really done right. As they focus on this trajectory towards riches. I think it's hard to say that it had an effect in this case. Wilson certainly, you know, I take him to be sincere in his protestation that it did not. I would want to argue with you that the danger is a real one, and that, you know, maybe Wilson shouldn't have been the PI. Maybe someone else should have been the PI who, you know, who didn't have that kind of a. But, you know, was Wilson involved in the day-to-day running of the study and in its, you know, in the intricacies of its design? I'm not sure that he was.
But the people who were doing that stuff were being paid by him.
Absolutely.
And to be fair, I mean, to be clear, there's general recognition that having a financial stake in the research that you're doing is a mistake. That that's not in the public's best interest.
Beyond whatever the cutoff is, right?
Beyond whatever the cutoff is small.
No, it's a lot smaller than Wilson actually had. So I think, you know, most people do feel that COI is an important issue. I mean, it's unclear that it really had a huge effect in a case like this one. We do need to pay some attention to it. I mean, probably most people, there are COIs, you know, zealots and COI skeptics, and it becomes a political argument. I mean, if you're sort of in favor of capitalism and entrepreneurship and all that, I mean, you're going to be a little more skeptical about it. And if you're against those things and you feel like the government should be running the research enterprise, you're going to be more zealous about it. But I think, you know, wherever you stand on that debate, I mean, there is sort of a meeting in the middle, and I think everybody does agree that, you know, maybe cases like this ought to be avoided. But did it actually have a huge effect in this case? I'm not sure that it did. I mean, I think Wilson's argument is fairly persuasive as to it not being a big factor in terms of what happened. Okay, so why did they design the study the way that they did? And I think that's a very interesting point, because the people who designed it actually raised this concern. And they went and talked to some bioethicists. And you know, prominent bioethicist at Penn, who's still a prominent bioethicist, he's no longer at Penn, Art Kaplan, you know, gave them this advice that no, babies are not the right population to do this study in. And what was his rationale for that? His rationale for that was they cannot give consent. And autonomy, I mean, it gets back to the earlier question, you know, what are we about in terms of protecting people? Are we about protecting autonomy and fostering autonomy? Or are we about protecting subject welfare? And Kaplan said, we're about autonomy. If we're going to do things to people, we want to do things to people who can you know, understand and make a decision and consent. And that's important. That's so important that that's who we should do this in, you know, rather than helpless infants who don't have that, you know, who are necessarily without autonomy. So you come down on the autonomy side and you say that's where we need to put our effort, as opposed to the welfare side.
So then how can we ever improve care for those that can't consent today?
Well, this gets back to what's more important. I mean, for me, this gets back to what's more important. And part of the reason this comes home to me is because, my perspective is mostly, in terms of experience, it's that of a clinician. And I have this sort of orientation towards this yin and yang thing as a clinician. And, maybe those of you who are clinicians would have some feeling about this. I mean, what's more important in your mind when it comes to taking care of patients? Is it autonomy, or is it, your role acting in the patient's best interest? Your role being somewhat parental. I mean, what would those of you who are clinicians say to that?
It depends a lot on the situation.
Okay.
I think there are times when autonomy wins and times when paternalism wins, and it depends on the example. I mean, I think this study probably should have been done in the infants who had very high mortality. But if I was going to take the opposite argument to that, like you look at most phase 1 trials for drugs, they're done in adults. They really don't do phase 1 trials of new drugs in children ever. They're almost always approved in consenting adult populations and then tried in children later after they've shown to be safe. And so I think you could make that argument in this situation too. But and I think I think when you're dealing with a very dire circumstance, like a child that has almost no chance of living, you have to take over paternalism to try to do what you can for that child versus, another situation where you have a consenting adult that understands the benefits or risks of their behavior or their decision and for whatever reason really wants to do against your, recommendations, that's their choice. And so, I think it's very individual, the situation, which one's going to win out.
As someone that routinely consents parents, because I work in the NICU, and so that's the only person that I do consent is parents. And there's such huge leaps that have happened because of medications administered. So surfactants wouldn't exist, nitric oxide for pulmonary hypertension wouldn't exist if these medications weren't introduced into that patient population. I think you just have to be very mindful of the consenting process, and I do give parents a lot of space before I actually will have them sign anything. We give them, multiple days. I don't wait in the room after I explain the study to get their signature. I do give them that room and space and that consideration, but I think it's so necessary to target that population.
So two sort of supporting suggestions that autonomy is really pretty important.
So if this death, would have occurred in the day of an infants, and the same case would have happened where the kid died from the treatment, is it somehow less egregious in that setting?
I think so. I mean, that child that would have died anyway.
But logically, I don't make the connection. But it's somehow, somebody who did consent to the study, and a bad outcome happens, but because he was, somewhat healthier.
So I want to sort of try to pull out.
Yeah, I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate.
Well, I'm trying to pull out how that would go, and maybe how it would go would be, if somebody's helpless and incapable and completely dependent on you.
Not even necessarily that. It's just that.
Is it worse to do something?
Is a bad outcome somehow worse? So an unexpected bad outcome is somehow worse in one population than it is in another.
Well, the way I would try to make it persuasive would be, I might say, is it worse to do something to somebody who's helpless and really completely dependent on you? And you're in this position where you really are sort of responsible. Isn't it worse if you do something bad to that creature than to do something to somebody in which you and that subject are on the same page and there's this need in mind.
This gene therapy.
And yes, something bad may happen, but, there's an autonomy connection there. And doesn't that mitigate the badness of it?
Yeah.
Compared to the other situation?
I mean, if we were talking about healthy infants versus healthy adults, then yeah, absolutely. But we're talking about infants that are going to die anyway.
But your treatment is still potentially
It's a
shortening
difference
the
in loss
life
of life. You're talking about a shortening of the life of a few months in someone who's never going to have a chance to grow up or be a productive member of society or have any quality of life versus someone who's already demonstrated that they have quality of life, that they're functioning, adolescent who can go on and do whatever they want. I mean, there's a vastly different loss of life in those two situations. And even like with some of the, examples of like surfactant in the NICU, I mean, you're going to use that for micro preemie babies to test it for the first time, babies that really don't have a chance at living, or much chance of living a normal or healthy life. So.
But when you don't know that treatment's effective, should you do it in that population of people?
Which the alternative is no treatment, though.
Filters and
Yeah, but what if your treatment's worse? What if it's not, it doesn't really have much
Can't
effect,
get much
and it
worse than
kills
that.
Yeah, but so that my argument though is that, so because they're gonna die, it's okay if we kill them off quicker
In the
to
context
see if this treatment works.
But in the context of a phase 1 trial, that's what this is getting at. is
I mean, you look
safety.
at patients with cancer, like high cancer mortality. I mean, someone who is thought to only have a few months to live. I mean, that population is a more appropriate population to try a brand new therapy than, someone where there's effective treatments and has a better prognosis. I mean, you pick the highest risk population to try something brand new because they have less to lose.
And it's something that gets teased out in the consenting process. You explain this risk. Your baby is going to die in X amount of years, regardless of treatment or no treatment. But if we, expose your baby to this treatment, there's a potential for your baby to live longer. And there's
But we don't really,
there's
there's a potential for your baby to live shorter too.
Yeah, that's part
Yeah,
of it.
That's part of the consent process.
Less so than this treatment really has the potential that they could live longer. And that's what we're.
Let me just discuss a quick case that what happened in the NICU recently. There's a kid with Meeke's hair syndrome, I think is the name of it. That's a copper metabolism issue, and these babies die, I think, before they're 3 years old. And there is a guy in Massachusetts that's enrolling babies in a copper supplement thing, and these parents obviously jumped to consent to this thing because they are in this desperate situation, and where they have this newborn infant that is going to die, and they are desperate for these things, for these treatments. They want so desperately for their kid to survive, and they will, very routinely consent to these things because they do not want that eventual outcome to occur. They want this more than I think the researchers want.
This is a chance of.
Hail Mary.
Right, it's a Hail Mary. I mean, it's this horrible trajectory that we're on, and this is a possible way out.
Right. So if you are withholding treatment from this parent that's so desperate because of this potential negative outcome, I think the parents, even more than the researchers, would be even more inclined to have the study of this.
But you also have to look at the babies, they're gonna die regardless. So there's no change there. You're not saving anyone, whereas if you don't do it in the older population, you're saving Jesse's life. Those kids are gonna die anyway. So it adds a
Yeah, it's
death,
not-
doing it to them. It doesn't add or take
It's not
away a
they're
death. to
doing
do
it,
on
but it's
babies.
when there's a bad outcome, an unexpected bad outcome.
I think there's another interesting component to this idea of autonomy related to Jesse that I think I think when you think about this idea of autonomy, it has certain implications for the broader culture that don't necessarily play out. Because, for all we know, if you're thinking about somebody acting as their own agent, you're kind of assuming that they're going to say, okay, well, you know what, I'm going to be sacrificial lamb for science. Like, that's okay by me. Like, I'm going to accept whatever comes my way, I'm going to do this, like, let's do it, I'm altruistic.
That was Jesse's frame of mind. He literally, and you read more about the case. I mean, when he was talking about doing the study, he said, I'm in on this. I want to do this for the babies.
Right, and then if you have somebody like that who says, even if it means my death, there are some eyebrows that kind of tend to go up in the kind of broader culture and saying like, really? Like, you're doing pretty okay, like right now, like, shouldn't we have you meet with a psychiatrist before we enroll you in this study? Because, there's a lot of implications to that as well. You don't have people kind of come in and off the street saying like, well, like, if I die, that's fine. Like, I'm going to do it and have them taken at face value.
But I don't think he was purely altruistic. If you read the accounts of his father and his arm getting run over by the van because he got so upset that he didn't want to adhere to the diet restrictions anymore. He'd been hospitalized near death, put on a ventilator in the past. He had his own motives, I think, that were beyond just altruism. He didn't want to be hampered by this disease, and he was looking for a cure. So,
sure, and I think that all goes under your kind of conceptualization of what he did and also what happened to them. So, like, if you go in there with an assumption that the autonomy was the most important factor, no matter what kind of the other voices are that come up, does that make his death okay because he okayed it?
Well, and just as the parent of a teenager, teenage boys they're They're not the smartest.
They're not really responsible.
They're not.
You can't be allowed to make decisions. They should not be allowed.
There's a lot of emotion, like, of any teenager with any chronic illness. We look at it in all of our fields that deal with teenagers with diabetes or lupus or chronic kidney disease or whatever. They go through this rebellion period of just not wanting to do it anymore. So
They're not.
are they really thinking clearly about the decision anyway?
But autonomy is also involving having all of the information at your disposal in order to make an educated decision. And I might be incorrect, but I thought I remembered that there were a lot of toxicities that were not reported in previous patients. And so if he was not aware of that, then
So,
he's truly making an informed decision.
so the design of the study, in a way you could argue that you look at the trajectory of society from 1970 to 2016, and the whole sort of way of thinking about autonomy and its importance, and the way that changed over that period of time. And you could say that, well, in 1960, this study would have been designed for babies. And there's this entire sort of shift in our cultural outlook on the importance of autonomy. And, in 1997, the entire bioethics community was autonomy, autonomy, autonomy. And that was what prevailed in how this was set up. And I asked the question earlier, how does clinical experience and a perspective as a clinician sort of bear on thinking about this? And my own view would be, I take care of patients at the VA hospital, and I had a practice over at Kirkland Clinic for 20 years, which I didn't want to have, but I did that, and to some extent do that. And patients just aren't that autonomous. They're just not. Come on. When I'm trying to get somebody to do something, it's all about how I frame it. It's all about how, and yes, I'm not going to do something to somebody who doesn't want, who says no. But there's so much power in framing a situation and making the case that, you need to do this and this is why, and appealing to whatever I need to appeal to get them to do the medically right thing. And the medically right thing is so primary. And, the ideal type of patient is not some sort of rational, autonomous, master of the state, super Nietzschean Superman. The ideal type of a patient is a frail, vulnerable, ignorant person who I need to sort of be responsible for and do the right thing for and get them to make the right decision. And that's what medicine is about. And protection of patients is what medicine is about. Autonomy is overrated. That's the kind of case as a clinician that I would want to make. And as a clinician, looking at the design of this research study, I would say, come on! The research community has a responsibility to take care of the people, their human subjects. And how can they even consider in a 17-year-old healthy adolescent. How could that even be possible?
You could argue, is there really does autonomy even exist when it comes to medical decisions for patients? Because the assumption of autonomy is that you completely understand the risks and benefits. And I don't think as a patient without medical training, you could argue they never really understand the risks and benefits. You could sit there and lecture to them for an hour, and unless you've seen patients that have gotten that treatment and done poorly, and you've seen it and you know what it means, you know what it's doing, there's a whole different understanding that the patient's never going to have.
And isn't that also true of the research consent process? And isn't it the case that, whether or not somebody wants to get into your study or not, a lot of it's going to depend on how they react to you, and whether they trust you, and whether they feel that, you're a good person, you're sort of on their side somehow, and you want to do the right thing for them. And isn't that like 15,000 times more important than the fine print of the sort of, whatever the pro and con risks and benefits are, some of which you may be able to get across to them. But, to what extent do they really fully understand everything? Probably never.
Well, and as you get older, you'll be a patient, and you'll recognize that you want to turn over some decision-making to the physician. You may want to know more than the average patient might want to know, but in the end, you're going to be a patient.
Every time I've explained, a lot of intricate details to patients, I watch as their eyes slowly okay, whatever you think is best, doctor.
Yes, shared decision making. I mean, it's a protecting village. I mean, it's
Okay, I gotta back up.
And you may have, I've had situations where I tried really hard to get somebody to understand, and they were so depressed by the reality that it made the whole thing worse, for sure. It's just,
So the argument I would want to make is that, we should be about taking care of people. We should be about what really is in someone's best interest to be done for them. And that's how we should design our research, and that's how we should practice medicine. And yes, the two things are a little bit different. There are other things going on in the research relationship. I mean, you're not simply out to take care of the person. You're there to get knowledge, and we need to recognize that as researchers, we're not on the patient's side to quite the same extent as we are as clinicians. But we ought to be on the patient's or the subject's side to a great extent. And certainly we ought not to, if we can do something in a population that has very little to lose and maybe something to gain, that's very different from doing it in a population that has everything to lose. So I would want to push back against what happened and say, look, you're crazy. But I guess you probably imagine the kind of argument. I mean, it's not without some power. The argument that helpless, it's hard to do things to helpless creatures that depend on us.
It's also hard to do nothing.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we could jump into the NPRM, but I think we should probably just stop. Maybe some other time. Talk about the NPRM. Great discussion. Thank you all very much. And that, that's the IRB, that's what the IRB says.
That's what I did too, but in my.
Absolutely.
Where.
So this was one too, where the institution was involved in the cover-up, right? Or was that a different?
That's I don't think it was covered.
We get feedback from students, participants, and if you have, actually, if you have specific themes you want the search.
I have to get my car. Yeah.
I'll see you later.
So,
Well, I'm just most interested in, whether it's engaging or whether they feel like they're doing something.
yeah, we did try to ask them specific things to stay, like,
What's your email?
stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, something.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear that.
Right.
And you know, I mean, you want to jump some more sessions.
Yeah, I guess I know people are interested. This is a good, this is good, some research. Early research.
Went back to their respective institutions, kind of like, they don't want to follow up, because then I could like